I've done some stuff with the junior programs with Athletics Australia for a few years now. So some of what we're going to talk about today, I've stolen from the AA program, so apologies to anyone who's part of the under-19 program, because you're going to hear this all repeated, which you've probably heard before. And I've have to give credit to Ben Raysmith at AIS, who I've stolen half his presentation because I was a bit lazy to put together my own today. So to begin with, we're going to talk about injury prevention and returning from injury. Now, if you were present when we talked about some of the things back in May when I talked, you would have heard me say that in terms of why we care about injury prevention is because if you, in the 6 months leading up to your main event, if you train 80% or more at full training level, you're 7 times more likely to achieve your goal. And that's the study that they've done at the AIS looking at the senior athletes there. So in effect, if you can be out there training consistently throughout the year, you're more likely to achieve your goal. So that's why I want to prevent them. So it makes clear sense. First up, we want to talk about the body and how adaptable the body is. So I think the thing to understand is that our human body is a living tissue, so it responds to everything that we do. So I'm going to give you examples of this. When we get sick, our immune system gets down, we feel ill, then as an adaptation process to getting sick, your body starts to fight that illness, you get better, and then you're actually more resilient if that same sickness comes again or that same medical illness comes again. So you can fight that a bit better. And that's your body's way of adapting to that in future. Another example is when you go to the gym. So when you go to the gym, you start doing weights. After a few months, you get stronger and stronger. Again, that is your body adapting to that process, okay? When we learn a new skill. So I've got a little 7.5-month-year-old at the moment, and he is not yet up to crawling. I don't know if Ben's yours can crawl yet. No, not yet. Good. Not behind yet. Yeah, not yet crawling, not yet walking. You guys can all crawl, walk, run. So it took you time to learn that skill, but your body adapts to learn. So I think that's another example for you guys that your body can adapt mentally and get that side. Bed rest studies. So they've looked at studies where people have had the misfortune of having to lie in bed for many months at a time, and they've looked at their bone density, and their bones start to wither away as they're lying in bed. So they get weaker in their bones, their muscles get weaker, their tendons get small. But the interesting thing is, because they're lying down, their skull bone gets thicker, because we don't usually put weight through our head. We don't usually lie on it for that long. So interesting enough, although the other parts of their bones, like their leg bones, got weaker, their skull bone got stronger. So again, just through applying different loads, or the body's now learnt to adapt. So and astronauts are the same thing. When if you guys have ever seen from the 60s and 70s, when they landed the astronauts back down to Earth and they pulled them out, wheeled them out in wheelchairs, and these guys are just withered, they can't stand up. So now in the spaceships, they get them up there in space on treadmills and doing little weights, just so they can resist the anti-gravity there. So putting in load in that means. So that way they can get out and start walking and loading earlier. So the thing to ask you guys then is, when you're returning from a break, so say, okay, you've done nationals, you've had a break, you've had a few weeks off, when you return, are you as fast as you were when you didn't, then at nationals, or are you as strong as you were? And for many of you guys, the answer would be no, you're not, because you've had a few weeks off. In that time, your body's got a little bit weak, you've lost some muscle mass, you would have lost that neural control, maybe if you're a distance runner, you've lost that cardiovascular endurance. So I think the thing to understand is that after a break, you're not quite as strong. Your body's adapted to doing less, okay? And that has implications going forwards. So this is your normal training routine. When we train hard, we put in load, and you'll probably find that when you train, you start to get tired and fatigued, and then your coaches, they go, okay, we'll back you off a little bit, give you an easy week, let you recover, and then from that recovery you get stronger, and then you train hard again, and then you start to get a bit fatigued, they pull you back, you recover, you get stronger, and that's that normal periodised program that we're going to hear about later. Rod's doing that for us later. So that's the normal system of the body adapting, that it gets stronger through applying load, but we have to give it time for that to occur. If we do too much and don't give the body enough time to recover, we start to, our capacity, or in terms of this red line, goes down. And I don't know if any of you guys have felt that before, when you just start training yourself into the ground. You train hard, you're tired, you go, I'm going to train harder, you get further tired, and it's just this non-stop cycle, and then you've got to pull back and really recover. Has anyone actually suffered from that before? No, I'm guilty of it. Yep, Simon has. So normal for endurance people, being a walker, I'm a distance runner, that happens. I'm not sure if this is sprints and jumps and multis and hurdles and things, so yeah, we'll get a different answer out of the distance people. So basically the concept of what I'm trying to say is that when you apply a stimulus to your body, it has to adapt to that, and then you get stronger. But if you apply too much, then you need to give your body some time to recover and to build up further. That's all we're trying to say with this. All right, where am I going? So, what influences our loads? There's extrinsic factors and intrinsic factors. So extrinsic factors are things that you're doing in terms of your footwear, your how fast you run, the terrain you run on, how many Ks you do. So those are your extrinsic factors. Your intrinsic factors are your muscle strength, bone, fatigue, all those internal things. Now, often we do a lot in terms of this sort of stuff, in terms of getting our body strong, doing our stretching, doing our recovery, sleeping well, etc. But this is where we'll flip to Benny Raysmith stuff, if I can. Didn't work. Give me one seckie. Sorry guys, here we go. Okay, so what they found that probably more important is the extrinsic things in terms of injury or illness. So it's often more about how much you're doing, the speed you're running. Those things are more important, and they're the easy things that your coaches can manipulate. Okay, so although you still should look after yourself in terms of recovery and strength, what you're actually doing at training influences your risk of injury and illness more so. So, what's the key message out of all of this? Is that we want to establish a level of training, a level base of training whereby there's minimal fluctuations. So large fluctuations in how much you do, the body has to adapt to. So if we're going along, and I'll put it in terms of a distance runner because it's probably easier here, your distance runner's running 80 Ks a week, okay? If they suddenly jump to maybe 120 K a week, it's a big change and their body's not adapted to that. So their body, therefore, to run 120 Ks has to get stronger, develop the bone density for that, develop the cardiovascular endurance for that. So to do that, you've got to progress slowly because it's not going to, muscle takes months to, to build and grow. Same with bone, okay? Cardiovascular endurance also takes a bit of time. So it's not something that happens overnight. It's not like a light switch switching on and off. got to give it time. So establishing a nice even level means that there's less up and down, okay, where your body has to adapt. And the same time as going up, if we have a break or a lower point, then we've talked about this with a break before, your body deteriorates and you're not going to be quite as fast or strong. And then you've got to build that body up nice and gradually to reach that homeostasis or that level that we were at before, okay? The other thing to understand is that we don't always have to shy away from reaching a high level, a high base of training. It is safe to do quite a lot of work as long as you get there slowly and gradually and give your body time to adapt. And it can be preventive of injury in that if you're running at 100 Ks a week for a distance runner, a jump of 10 Ks to maybe 110 K a week is only a 10% change. It's a small change. Whereas that same 10K jump, if you're running 20 or 30 K a week and they jump, so they're running 30 K a week and jump 10 Ks, that then is a 33% change. So it's a much bigger change. So if you're doing a lot more, small little fluctuations or big fluctuations is actually a lot smaller in the scheme of things. Okay, so it is safe as long as you get there slowly. So that's something to understand. So we don't always shy away from doing a lot as long as you get there gradually. So that's good for coaches, because some coaches want to get you doing a lot. One thing to understand that we've often seen is that people will sometimes turn up to the clinic and go, you know, we might identify someone with a stress fracture, and they'll be like, I have done nothing, you know, that yesterday, so they've turned up, I'm sore today, yesterday I did my normal training for the past week, I've been doing my normal training, nothing strange has happened, it's been status quo for a while. But often what happens is that it's 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks beforehand that there's a change in load. That's what we find. So when returning from a break, again, if you've had that, you've had nationals in March, then you've had a break through April, and then in May you're back training. It might not be till June that you're injured because the change in load happened then, which caused the body to be susceptible, and then further loads onto that made it break. Okay, so often it doesn't have to be what you did now, but it can be what you've done 4, 5, 6 weeks ago that makes a difference to it. Okay. So we've talked about this, minimise large week-to-week fluctuations. I don't need to talk about that one either. So ideally what you want to see is that, as we've talked about, that with your how much you do every day or every week, that there's only tiny little changes. For coaches out there, if you want numbers, often if this is 100% through the middle, 80% and 130% of your normal training, measuring your, I suppose I'm going to go in depth here. Say coaches, if you've got your training for a week and you know what you've done that 1 week, and that's measurable, if you then get an average of your past 6 weeks or 4 weeks and put that current week over that average of your past 4 to 6 weeks, we're looking at a ratio or a percentage of about 130% as a max and 80% as a minimum. Okay, and that can be your roof and your ceiling and your floor. So basically what you've done in the history in the past 4 to 6 weeks makes a difference for what you can do now in the current week. Okay? Does that make sense, or am I speaking crap? Good. People are nodding. It could be either one of the... So that sort of stuff's important. That's the stuff that the coaches will manipulate. What you athletes can manipulate is some of those other intrinsic factors. So that's your recovery, and your sleep and your diet. And I see you guys have got your milk and bananas and things, so your carbs and your proteins right now. That sort of stuff post-training is really good for your recovery. Going to bed early and getting some decent sleep, not staying on your phones all night. Getting some mental relaxation, hitting the gym, getting strong, all those factors you guys can do to fix up that internal, intrinsic loading. Whereas the coaches probably take a bit more responsibility of the external, extrinsic stuff. Alrighty. So we slightly talked about this before, and the key times that we see injuries and we've got to be careful of is more so after a break. So it's not usually in the middle of the season, it's not usually at the end of the season, it's always at the start of the season that we see the injuries occur. And it's always for the reason that you've had a break and then we've hit the break and we're keen to go, you've got all this energy just stored inside of yourself, so you want to go out there and train hard. But again, going back to what we talked about with the body adapting, if you guys are sitting around doing nothing for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, which I don't say is a bad thing if you need to mentally recover and physically recover, but understand that you're not going to be as strong, you're not going to be as fast, so you have to build up gradually. And the same thing goes if you've had an injury. If you've had an injury, you're not going to be as strong, you're not going to be as fast initially. You have to build up very, very, very slowly back up to your peak level. So when do we see injuries occur? We see them around about, if you guys have nationals in March, as we sort of said, you might have April off, you might start training in about May, so it's around late May, June that we often see injuries occur in your group, or we see them around that January time, just after that December drop. So you might have had school carnivals, then had a rest from schools or done exams, then start training a bit in December or have Christmas holidays, and in January see a few injuries in this group, okay? So they're the things to be wary about, is that if I am having a break, I need to build up slowly. Or coaches can also think about, if we're having a break, are there things we can do to reduce the change when we do actually return to training? And that might be doing a little bit of gym, going for some really light exercise, and it doesn't have to be as regular as you were, but intermittently. Other things might be, if you've got a lot of travel days, so say you're competing internationally and you have to spend 2 or 3 days travelling around, well, that's a loss in training load. So maybe, and Ben's talked about this before, people running up and down the airport or doing some jumps up and down in the airport or in their hotels, or just trying to get some movement and some load into your body. As silly as it sounds, it might help prevent injuries going forwards. All right, now let's get back to this PowerPoint. So, returning from injury is quite simple then, if we use that thought process. In terms of returning from injury, you want to make sure, A, you've identified your causative factors. So why did you get injured? Was it that you changed your load too much? Was it that you weren't strong enough, or you just did something that you weren't capable of? Try and find the reasons as to why this occurred and then address them. That's really important. If you don't do that, you're probably setting yourself up for re-injury over and over again. Give your body time to adapt. So understand it's going to take time. As I sort of addressed briefly, strengthening muscle and bone takes many, 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 many months. So it's not something that just happens overnight, okay? I think the next point in blue, I shouldn't have put it in blue because it's bloody hard to see for you guys after all that. We'll see if we get it bigger. No, still no better. I want you to think about, when you're returning from injury, to not think about what you're doing as training. When you start thinking about it as training, I think that's where we go wrong, because your mindset's, okay, I've got to go out there and perform really well, run hard, throw hard, do gym hard, etc. I think you've got to think about it as doing it as purely rehab, even when you're returning. So everything that you're doing is rehab or conditioning your body or getting your body back to where you want it to be, okay? So I think if you go in there and go, again, I'll bring a distance runner thought, we might say to them, okay, you're going to run 5 minutes today, and then they'll just go out there and smash themselves for 5 minutes, run as hard as they can, and that's not the thought. That's not what we're trying to do. We might just be trying to condition their body to run for 5 minutes, which is a tiny amount of time for a distance runner. Same thing for sprinters. You might be doing sets of 80 metres at jog pace, but your temptation is to go out there and run hard because you're like, this is easy, I can do this. But what we're trying to do, the physio's thinking is, we've got to get your body used to running at this pace, adapt it to that, and then adapt it to the next bit, and then the next bit faster and faster. So it's just allowing time to do that. But if you go out there thinking, this is training, I've got to train hard, this is what I'm used to, you're likely to injure yourself. And as I talked about coaches, you can think about when someone is injured, what other things can we do? You know, hamstring injuries, can we get them just skipping up and down the spot to load up their calves? Yes. You know, or jumping. Can you get them running slower? Can you start doing things in the gym? There's plenty of things that you can do, and you can be creative about it, whereby you won't aggravate the injury, but you can maintain the loads high. And the advantage of that is that when you get the green light from the docs to actually start training and returning, you're in a better position, and it won't take anywhere near as long. So thinking about that when you are injured is very important. So that's all I'm about to talk about, because I think we've got Rod coming in a second. But does anyone want to ask any questions about loads or returning from injury? I've actually got a little slide I can show you. I'm going to make this accessible to you guys. I'll send this to Ben King, and he can send out some of this stuff to the coaches and athletes. But this is a little graph which they've done through a lot of these algorithms at the AIS to work out how long it should take for you to rebuild after having time off or a break or whatever. So I think commonly a lot of you guys might have between 2 or 4 weeks off after nationals. So say you've had 4 weeks off here, and then during that 4 weeks off you did nothing. So the light blue line should take you almost about 6 weeks to return back to full training. So you've got to set that 6 weeks into your program. So it's not 2 weeks, I'll be back in 2 weeks at my full training, it's 6 weeks later. So if you've had 2 weeks off, it's 5 weeks. So just understand that when you do have a break, to build up slower, if you do a bit more, say if John, he's our person that's had a break, he did a little bit, so he did 40% of his loads, takes him 2.5 weeks to build up back to full training. So if coaches want to start playing around and thinking about, oh, okay, we might just get you doing a little bit in your break, it might help speed up that process back to full training if you think that's important. And that might be important if you've got a short turnaround between, say if you've got nationals and someone's made World Juniors and you're going, well, I don't want to give them a big break, I want to give them a break but not a massive break, and when we get back I want them to be training well, I might have to get them doing a little bit to get that short turnaround between, say, nationals and a World Juniors.
All right, ready to roll? So I'm Rodney Siegel, you guys can call me Rod. So we're going to talk a little bit about training periodisation today. And so obviously, given that we've got a wide range of different events, both here and in the next group as well, we won't talk specifically about what your actual training program might look in terms of periodisation, but more in terms of periodising how you go about your year and your plan from a strategic point of view a little bit. So we'll run through, this is sort of what we're sort of looking at here. So a bit of periodisation in terms of how you're going about coming up with and getting towards your performance goals. So first, there might be things like an assessment. So looking at the event requirements, what the competitive requirements are, what your individual athlete and characteristics and requirements are. what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and what are your any performance and physical type of measures that you might do. And we'll sort of get into that in more detail. Then from that you might create a plan, a bit of a short-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term plan. Implementation, simple, the really easy part, hopefully. Putting the plan into action and trying to live and execute your plan. Then we monitor it. And so, what's your training response? What's things like your training load, like Kev was just talking about there? How are you progressing? Are you actually regressing? Sometimes you do training, you actually start going backwards if you're doing the wrong sort of thing. Then evaluate how you went. So it might have been an event, it might have been a training block, that sort of thing. What was the outcome? What do you think worked from that block and what do you think didn't work? And then we start all over again. What's next? And we go all over again and sort of start the process again. So, some of this might be something that you guys are thinking about in a little bit more or less detail depending on sort of what your age is at the moment, where along the performance pathway you are. It might be something that your coach is doing entirely for you at this point in time, or it might be something that you need to start thinking about, doing in conjunction with your coach. So assessment, event requirements. So I've just got a bit of an example here. We might say we've got a 1500 metre runner, which I don't think we do in this room. This is not the distance group. Everyone saw that. So what might be some of the physical requirements for a 1500 metre runner? Surely. Endurance, yep. What else? The coaches can't answer, that's cheating. Just yell it out. Yeah, lung capacity, yep. What else? Anything else? There's going to be heaps of different things. So, aerobic capacity or endurance, anaerobic capacity or raw speed, running economy, how efficient you are, things like leg stiffness. So when you think of sort of the stiffness and the spring in your tendons, that's really, really important to running fast. And things like body composition, how much muscle mass do you have, how lean do you need to be. So all these things are important to figure out, and for each of you, depending on what your event is, with you and your coaches are probably already doing this sort of thing, is thinking, what are the physical requirements of the event? Then from there, what are the competitive requirements? So that could be a whole lot of different things, but for a 1500 metre runner, and it's going to depend where you are in the performance pathway and what time of the season you're in and all that sort of thing. But if you're an under 18 1500 metre runner, the reality is you're probably going to have to run around about 3 minutes 43 for a male and about 4:06 for a female. So if you're going to win, they're the under 18 national records. If you're going to win your event, you're probably sort of targeting that. Doesn't mean you're targeting it this week, the next event, may not even be this season, but sort of somewhere in your mind, the reality is that's sort of where your target sort of needs to be. And if you're not thinking towards that and all the boxes you might need to tick along the way, you may sort of miss things along the way. And what we've noticed is that athletes that have a plan that's very targeted generally follow that plan a little bit better and end up hitting their performance targets a little bit better. And then there's other things like tactics. So what sort of sports do we have in here today? What events have we got in this room now? Sprints, hurdles, yeah. So great, perfect. Not as much tactics involved. Get from the start line to the end line as quick as you can. But in other events, certainly tactics can play a part. So in our example, the 1500 metre runner, certainly tactics can play a really big part. So you need to come up with an assessment of what type of tactics do you need to be prepared for. If it's going to be a slow race, the first couple of laps are really slow, and then comes a really fast last lap, are you prepared in that situation, or are you only prepared if it's one of those races that sort of go from gun to tape? So you need to sort of think about the different requirements from the event point of view. Then you get onto your individual characteristics and requirements. So are you a real speed demon, or are you a diesel? Do you need to improve your endurance, or have you already got really good endurance? You need to just improve your speed. What about strength, endurance, technique, body composition for you individually? So we know sort of what we think the event requirements are. You might be already ticking half of them, but you might need to work on some of those individually. And what about, things, a little bit to the side of that? So what about nutrition? How well do you do your nutrition? Has injury been an issue for you in the past? What sort of injury prevention stuff do you need to do? Recovery sort of stuff. What about race performance? You might have all the talent in the world, but you're not necessarily performing as well on the day. What can you do in terms of your race or your event performance capacity? What are your strengths? What are you good at? Oftentimes people think, okay, well, I'm good at this. I just need to focus entirely on my weaknesses. But generally a strength is a strength for a reason. You've developed it quite naturally. So, you're probably going to respond to training your strength quite well. A phrase that we sort of throw around here a little bit is feed the beast. There's a bit of a time to feed the beast, but then there's also time to work on your weaknesses. So, what are your weaknesses? How are you going to address your individual weaknesses? What sort of training do you need to do to address those? Without necessarily, again, so oftentimes a weakness is a weakness for a reason. It's something that you're not necessarily as naturally good at. If you focus entirely on your weaknesses, you might only make small amounts of gains, and we've seen that sort of thing before. So you need to be clever about that too. Then sort of any sort of physical assessment. So thinking of some of your events here, what physical assessments might you do for your sports? Throw some stuff out there. Yep, flexibility. What else? Strength, yep, great. What else? And how would you measure strength? Yep, something like a 1RM, yep. So there's a whole lot of different things that you might do. So in our example of our 1500 metre runner, they might do something like a 5,000 metre time trial to look at what their endurance is like. They might do a flying 400 lap to see what their raw speed is like. They might do something like a vertical jump or a drop jump to see what their muscular power is like and their stiffness qualities are like. There's sort of simple ones you can do out in the field, stuff that you might do, hoping eventually some of you guys might get a scholarship at the VIS, and stuff they might do at the more elite level is VO2 max testing, lactate testing, running economy, 1RM like we said before, some RSI testing, which is sort of testing those stiffness qualities of your muscles. Some power velocity based tests that you can do in the gym, all those sorts of things. So the physical assessments that make up the abilities that ultimately make up your sport, you can assess all of those in one way or another and then target types of training that will improve specifically those sorts of things. So from there you want to come up with your plan. And so oftentimes you sit down with your coach, or your coach might do this for you, is come up with an individual performance plan, all the things that are going to address what makes up your performance. So, and that will cover the short term. The short term might just be, the next few weeks, or it might be, up until the next competition or something like that. Might be the next training block, microcycles, the next few weeks, the next few months, your mesocycles, up to your next competition. Might be more medium term, so it might be this season. So what sort of goals do we want to plan towards just for this season? Sort of more your macro cycle type stuff. And then more long term. So what about the next 2 years, next 3 years? Often, more your senior athletes are thinking in the next 4 years in terms of Olympic cycles. Then hopefully the easy bit, implementation. The easiest bit hopefully, but probably the most important bit. So put your plan into action, and you want to live your plan. Execute your plan. And that generally requires diligence and consistency. So I'm often asked, I've been really, really lucky. I've gotten to work with some Olympic and world champions over the last few years, and people ask me, like, what do they do different to everyone else? Like, what magic do they do that just makes them so good? And the answer is really boring. They don't really do anything that impressive other than the fact that they're just naturally really good athletes. The thing that makes them stand out more than anybody else is that they're diligent, they follow their plan, and they're just really consistent. They turn up every day and they do what they need to do. That's it. There's no magic formula. It's really, really boring. And when my friends ask me what Olympic champions do and I tell them that, they think it's kind of dull, but that's the reality of it. But that's kind of the brilliance of it too. It means that, if anybody, sticks to it and is consistent, you can get really, really good gains. Monitoring. So this is often where people like to bury their head in the sand and they think, all right, if I do what I planned, everything's going to work perfectly and I can expect to see really good results. but that's not always the case, as I'm sure a lot of you guys probably know. So you want to monitor the training response. So things like, how are you performing day to day? How's your training actually going? How are you responding to your training? How are you coping with your training? Are you completely really flat all the time and you're too tired, or maybe it's not enough. I feel fine every day. I'm absolutely killing it. Maybe I'm not training hard enough. Things like your daily wellness. Kev may have touched on, with our more elite athletes will monitor things like daily wellness to ensure that they're not getting sick, they're not getting run down, things like that, from the training response. Then the training load. So Kev would have spoken a fair bit about this. So how much training are you doing? It might be time, kilometers, distance, number of jumps, number of throws, any of those different sorts of things. How hard are you training? RPE, so rating of perceived exertion. How hard does the training session feel? Speed, like how fast are you running? Power, if it's a power-based activity, how powerfully are you going through your activities? Things like heart rate, probably not as applicable to you guys, but more maybe your endurance athletes might use heart rate. Or kilograms, if you're doing weight-based training, how much total kilograms did you lift in a session? So lots of different ways to monitor how hard things are. And so importantly, probably touches really well on what Kev said. How much have you done before? What have you done before? And how quickly can you progress to what you're going to do next? So it's really good to have a plan, but if you sort of start to see and you're monitoring how much you're doing, you might think, oh, I'm actually progressing way too quickly here and I'm likely to maybe get injured. Or likewise, you might get into your training and go, oh, actually, based on some of the things that we're monitoring, I can probably ramp this up a little bit faster and make sure that I'm, get my gains a little bit quicker. And yeah, so I guess sort of the progression. Are you progressing? So, you're probably doing different sort of training sets and test sets that your coaches can ensure that, your speeds are improving in training. Maybe some strength exercise in the gym are actually progressing. And, you can look at that on a daily, weekly, monthly sort of basis, depending on what you're doing. And any of those assessments that we spoke about before, you might do, there might just be general training and we just sort of timing things, or we might do specific assessments to see if you're progressing. You might be running faster, as an example, but why are you running faster? Is it because, your just raw speed is improved? Is it because you're stronger? Is it because you're more powerful? You want to know why you've actually improved, so you know which abilities that you've trained have worked and which abilities that you've trained maybe haven't actually changed. So that's why we do individual assessments sometimes. And then regression. Again, sometimes we bury our head in the sand and think everything's going to go fine, but sometimes we do training, we actually go worse. Why might that be? Are we doing too much? Are we not doing enough? Have we gotten injured? All those sorts of things. So without monitoring our progress, we don't really know how we're going. Come to the end of the season, we want to evaluate how we went. So, what were the outcomes? It might be the outcome of your most important event for the year. Did you win? Did you achieve your performance goals or not? How did you actually perform? What improved? So from the beginning of the season until now, what actually improved from the things that you were trying to improve? And what didn't improve? There might be some things that you were trying to improve that didn't improve. And at how much, what was the actual progression rate? How much of the training that you were set by your coach did you actually complete? So again, if you're monitoring your training load or your training times, how much of it did you do? And we sort of know that athletes that generally do sort of 90% or more of their training generally, much more likely of hitting their performance targets. So if you get to the end of the season, you didn't hit your performance targets and you look back and go, oh, but I only did about 75% of the training, so that might be a reason why. And again, what worked? What did you do this season that you think really, really worked? Have a bit of a think, reflect back on what you've done in your training and in your preparation that you think really worked well. Some of the processes, what were the training stimuli that you used that you think really worked? Might be the weekly structure, simple things like that. How much you did each week, what was the distribution of the intensity, how did that fit around school and other activities and all those sorts of things. How could we tweak that to make it better next year? Again, things like tactics, nutrition, recovery, all those sorts of things. How did they go? How good did I do of a job at getting those things right? And then likewise, what didn't work? What didn't I do quite well? Or what did we do really, really well, but just didn't necessarily actually work for me? And then you get back to the reassessment at the beginning. What's next? what are we going to do next? And we go through the same process all over again. You know, it might be a year later, or it might be 6 months later, or whatever it might be. But now, you know, the event requirements are probably going to be about the same, and the competitive requirements. But you know, you're a different athlete now. You know, what are your individual characteristics and requirements? How have they changed? You know, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, and what are your performance assessments going to be this time around?